these works I've been talking about, move on to this last work I want to highlight. It's called The Jews and Their Lies. Now, Martin Luther, from what I understand from history, at the beginning of his ministry, he cared about Jewish people, and he wanted to reach out to them, and he even had some converts. And so he reached out to them, and after a while, some would get saved. But there was one, I think, from what I understand from history, was one who turned his back and went back to Judaism. And when he went back to Judaism, it really made Martin Luther upset. So he wrote this book called The Jews and Their Lies towards the end of his life. And we just read from the introduction first of those who translated his book into English. When we proceeded to have it translated, we were shocked and amazed at the interference we encountered from a wide variety of sources. 2 different translators were made the victims of intimidation, and only after a rather dramatic experience were we able to complete its translation in spite of its brevity. In effecting the translation of this work, we became increasingly convinced that a well-organized plot to keep this book hidden exists. They go on to say, we find among sincere Christian people a deep resentment over the fact that a work of one as prominent as Martin Luther has been kept so scientifically and so deliberately away from the eyes of millions of his admirers. Once again, they say, this is the first English translation we published in the United States, so far as we are able to ascertain. Note, this published work by Luther was among the last of his writings. Luther, it will be recalled, died in the prime of life, having lived only to the age of 63. So let's see what Luther had to say about the Jews in here. On page 9, we see that he says, much less do I intend to convert the Jews, for that is impossible. So he contends that all the Jews, all the Jewish people, are reprobates. That's what he says. Page 27. Therefore know, my dear Christian, that next to the devil you have no more bitter, more poisonous, more vehement an enemy than a real Jew who earnestly desires to be a Jew. So according to Luther, the greatest enemy Christians have, besides the devil, next to the devil, are Jewish people. Page 34. We do not know to this day which devil brought them into our country, speaking of the Jews. So the devil brought them into his country. Maybe it could have been God bringing them into his country so you can reach out to them and tell them the truth. Page 35. We like to add a present in order to get rid of them. They are a heavy burden to us in our country, like a plague, pestilence, and nothing but misfortune. On page 36, he said, thus it is our fault that we do not avenge the innocent blood which they shed on our Lord and the Christians for 300 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. And from that time on, children, which still shines from their eyes and skin, that we do not slay them, but for all their murder, cursing, blaspheming, and disgracing, permit them to dwell among us without charge, protect their schools, houses, body, and goods, by which we make them lazy and secure and help them confidently to squeeze from us our money and goods, and in addition to mock us and spit on us, hoping finally to overcome us and slay all of us for such great sin and take away all our goods as they daily pray for. Some pretty harsh words to say about Jewish people that that's what they're wanting to do to us. Now, could it be true of some Jewish people? Of course it could be true. But is this true of all Jewish people who were in Germany at that point in time? I seriously doubt it. Page 37. Now, what are we going to do with these rejected, condemned Jewish people? And then he gives a list of things he will do. And the second thing he said, the first thing, under the first thing, he says, Moses writes in Deuteronomy that where a city practiced idolatry, it should be entirely destroyed with fire and leave nothing. If he were living today, he would be the first to put fire to the Jew schools and houses. And he says, under the second thing, he says that you refuse to let them own houses among us. Instead, you might place them under a roof or stable, like the gypsies. So he's promoting some kind of like a ghetto type of situation for Jewish people. Thirdly, they take away from them all of their prayer books and Talmuds wherein such lying, cursing, and blaspheming is taught. So all the religious books, take them away. They can't have them. Can't have them. Fourthly, that you prohibit their rabbis to teach, for they have forfeited the right to such an office, because they keep the poor Jews captive with the passage of Moses, 7:11 and 7:12, who where commands them to obey their teachers under threat of losing body and soul. And so he doesn't want the rabbis to be able to teach. Okay. Fifthly, that protection for Jews on highways be revoked. You will learn from this book that what the Jews are and how they are to be treated, and that their activities are not to be protected. So those are some of the things he thinks should happen to Jewish people from his perspective. He goes on to say on page 53 that we refuse them the right to have synagogues, as we said earlier, that all their books should be taken away, prayer books, Talmuds, not one page would be left, that among us and in our possessions they should be forbidden openly to praise and thank God, to pray and to teach. Let them do that in their own country, wherever we Christians do not hear or know about it. That they be forbidden to mention the name of God before our ears, for we cannot suffer that with a clear conscience. Whosoever hear it mentioned by the Jews should report it to the rulers, etc. Let no one be merciful and kind in this respect. In my opinion, this is page 57, it will have to come to this. If we are to stay clean of the Jews' blasphemy and not become partakers of it, we must separate and they must leave our country. He goes on to say on page 57, he says, that they are also possessed of all the devils. Then on page 59 he says, as soon as my principal business has been accomplished, I shall have to devote myself to the expulsion of the Jews. Count Albrecht is hostile towards them, and he has already abandoned them. But as yet they are being molested by none. With the help of God I shall, in the sermons I hold from the pulpit, assist Count Albrecht, and shall also abandon them. And that's an extract from one of Luther's letters to his wife shortly before his death. And then in Luther's last sermon, which was a wanting against the Jews, these are some things he said. He died, I believe, a few days later. He said, we should not tolerate but expel them. He said, if they could kill us all, they would gladly do so. In fact, many of them murdered Christians, especially those professing to be surgeons and doctors. They gave people poison which brought about their death in 1 hour or in a month. He said, I cannot have patience nor carry on an intercourse with deliberate blasphemers and violators of our beloved Savior. Now, because of this book that Luther wrote at the end of his life, and this last sermon he preached on the Jews and his hatred towards them and his disdain for them, you can just see it coming through or hear it coming through in his words in this book on the Jews and their lies. Some people have wondered if what Luther said affected Hitler at all. And the fact is it did, friends. Hitler greatly liked Luther and his writings on the Jewish people. And in studying this, I found a Master of Liberal Studies thesis written on this issue between Luther and Hitler and their connection. And I just want to read you a portion of it. And it can be found online. And this is from page 41. By far the most striking similarity between Luther and Adolf Hitler is in their exceptional hatred toward the Jews. Such a hate is not frequently broadcasted in text, sermons, and speeches. But Luther and Hitler were not shy with their beliefs. Furthermore, the fact that both men were German and had such similar ideologies makes them a wholly unique duo. It is impossible to assume that Luther did not have any influence on Hitler and his views. Hitler refers to Martin Luther as one of the great reformers of history, and as such, one of the great warriors of this world. It cannot be mere coincidence that Hitler's anti-Jewish sentiment of the 1930s and 1940s mirrors that of Luther's anti-Semitism of the 1500s. In fact, the Nazis themselves acknowledged Martin Luther as their spiritual leader. When on trial in Nuremberg, Germany, after World War II, one of Hitler's top officials declared, Dr. Martin Luther would very probably sit in my place in the defendant's dock today, if this book had been taken into consideration by the prosecution. Dr. Martin Luther writes that Jews are a serpent's brood, and one should burn down their synagogues and destroy them. Although Martin Luther has never been put on trial, the Nazis seem to think that he was just as guilty as they are, or that they were just as innocent as he was. Some people in Hitler's time went so far as to believe that Hitler was the reincarnation of Luther. The Minister of Education in Nazi Germany wrote, since Martin Luther closed his eyes, no such son of our people has appeared again. It has been decided that we shall be the first to witness his reappearance. I think the time has passed when one may not say the names of Hitler and Luther in the same breath. They belong together. They are of the same old stamp. However people like to believe it, there is no denying the fact that Martin Luther and Adolf Hitler are inseparably linked with their extreme anti-Semitism and nationalism. It's because of this link that the line from Luther to Hitler runs straight, and that one of the main causes which turned Germany into a country of barbarians was Martin Luther and his German Reformation. One thing I haven't mentioned so far is that Luther, as you could tell from his quotes, that he didn't think that Jewish people belonged in the country of Germany. Even if they were born there, even if they lived there all their lives, he believed that they didn't belong there. They had their own country, Israel, and that they were driven from Israel, of course, by the destruction of the temple and the things that happened after that. And so he wanted them out of his country. So that was a form of nationalism, saying the Jews didn't belong there. And Hitler simply took those things and ran with it. In fact, a lot of the things that Luther proposed in his writings, Hitler took them and put them into action like Luther never did. Let's look at some of those things. Here are some things that Luther said should happen to Jewish people that Hitler actually took and ran with. Burn their synagogues, break into and destroy their houses, take away their prayer books, forbid their rabbis to teach, abolish their escort and band travel, prohibit the usury, force young Jewish girls and boys to work. And once Luther's initial steps were followed, Hitler went beyond and added his own to the list. Prohibit Jews from marrying or having relations with Aryans, move Jews into designated ghettos, sterilize those deemed inferior, including Jews, exterminate life unworthy of life, including Jews. So it seemed like Hitler took Luther's steps that I listed from his book and actually took action on them, and then he took them to their logical conclusions. They don't deserve life, they don't deserve to procreate, we don't want them to travel, we don't want them to live in our countries, so we'll make these places called ghettos and assign them to those places as well instead. And then he began to kill them, of course. So these are the things you see where Luther affected Hitler in some way. And Hitler not only recognized this, but a lot of the top people in Hitler's regime who didn't poison themselves and shoot themselves and have their bodies burned like Hitler did, and they were around for trial, said the same thing. And so it's time to stop considering Luther as some great reformer or some great theologian. He may have done some good things, he may have written some good songs, but it seems like later on in his life, he became poisoned with bitterness and anger and violence towards Jewish people. And the Bible says if you have hatred in your heart, you're a murderer at heart, and no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. And so hopefully this video was enlightening for you, gave you some more information you didn't know before so you can see the truth. And consider people by the truth, by the things they say. You know, Jesus says, out of the mouth comes the overflow of the heart. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And you shall be judged by every idle word. So we know what people are like, but what comes out of their mouth. And, you know, these things came out of Luther's mouth and from his pen, which is like coming from his mouth. And so we know what was in Luther's heart, and we know he wasn't right with God, and God will judge him for every idle